Picture something ancient. Not old in the way a forgotten castle is old, not ancient like ruins crumbling beneath ivy and time, ancient in a way that precedes memory itself, ancient like the first stirring of life in a primordial soup, ancient like the moment before consciousness divided into separate forms, when everything that would ever exist was blended together in one seething, chaotic mass of pure potential. Now open your eyes and look at the Erdtree, that golden monument towering over the lands between, that symbol of order and grace, that beacon of the greater will's authority. Beautiful, isn't it? Majestic, divine, the source of all blessings, the anchor of reality, the foundation upon which civilization itself stands. But what if I told you it's a lie? Not completely, but enough. What if that gleaming golden tree, symbol of order and refinement, is nothing more than a parasite that grew over something far older, far stranger, far more primal? What if beneath the gold lies something red-tinged and wild, something that churned with life in forms we can barely comprehend? Welcome to the story of the Primordial Crucible, and welcome to the story of its champions, the Crucible Knights. Tonight, we're going to peel back the golden veneer and look at what came before. We're going to explore an age when life itself was different, when the boundaries between species were fluid, when horns and scales and wings sprouted from flesh without reason or pattern. We're going to meet warriors who served the very first Elden Lord, knights who channeled powers so ancient that the current age treats them with scorn and fear. We're going to talk about an order of elite warriors who wore armor forged from primordial gold, who wielded the chaotic strength of the crucible itself, who fought to establish the Erdtree, and were then abandoned when that same tree forgot where it came from. We're going to meet Ordovis and Siluria, the legendary leaders of this order. We're going to follow Devonia, the longest-serving knight, on a solitary quest into the realm of shadow to find the very source of the crucible itself. And we're going to understand why these knights matter, why they're not just formidable warriors scattered throughout the lands between, but living monuments to a forgotten age, why their existence challenges everything the Golden Order claims about itself, why their story is inseparable from the Omen, the Hornsent, the Misbegotten, and every other being touched by that primordial chaos. This is a story about power and its consequences, about how what was once divine becomes demonic when the narrative changes, about warriors who remained loyal to an ideal even as the world they helped create turned against them, about the price of evolution, the cost of order, and what gets lost when chaos is purged from the system. So let me take you back before the Golden Order established its laws, back before Marika became eternal, back to an age when the first Elden Lord walked the lands between, when his axe rang against the shields of giants, when his Crucible Knights fought beside him wearing armor that glowed with that strange red gold light. Back to the Crucible, to where all life was once blended together, to the primordial wellspring from which everything in the lands between ultimately emerged. Chapter 1. The Primordial Crucible, where all life was blended. Imagine a crucible in the traditional sense. A container, ceramic or metal, designed to withstand extreme heat. a vessel where different materials are melted together, where solid becomes liquid, where distinct elements blend into something new. Alchemists used crucibles. Blacksmiths used crucibles. They're tools of transformation, places where separate things become unified through heat and pressure and time. Now, scale that concept up. Make it cosmic. Make it the birthplace of everything. That's the primordial crucible. Not a physical object you can point to, though it may have had a location once. It's both a place and a process, both a moment in time and an ongoing force, the primordial form of the Erdtree, the crucible of life itself, the torrent where all living things were once mixed together without distinction. Ancient incantations speak of it repeatedly. Those bestial powers that manifest horns and tails and fiery breath are described as manifestations of the Erdtree's primal vital energies, as aspects of the primordial crucible, where all life was once blended together. That phrase echoes through history like a prayer or a warning, where all life was once blended together. Think about what that means. Not separate species evolving along distinct lines, not humans here, dragons there, beasts in another category entirely. Everything mixed, everything connected. Life as a churning mass of potential from which individual forms occasionally emerged, but always with traces of everything else embedded within them. This wasn't order. This was beautiful, terrifying chaos. The crucible manifested as gold, but not the pure, gleaming gold of the Erdtree. The crucible's gold had a reddish tinge to it, primordial gold. Ancient texts call it the color of homeward yearning. It's a color that suggests blood mixed with precious metal, life force made visible, something organic that happens to shine. From this crucible came traits that we now consider aberrations. Horns growing from human skulls, scales covering skin, wings sprouting from shoulders, tails extending from spines, feathered growths, bony protrusions, characteristics borrowed from reptiles, from birds, from mammals, from creatures that don't fit into neat categories. All of it was normal once. All of it was blessed. The horn scent of the realm of shadow understood this. To them, horns weren't deformities. They were gifts from the crucible, signs of divine favor, proof that the bearer retained connection to that primordial source of life. The more tangled and complex your horns, the closer you were to the divine. The crucible was sacred to them because it represented life in its purest, most undifferentiated form. In the ancient ruins of Rao, where the power of the crucible once flourished, you can still feel its presence. The ruins are overgrown, flooded, split by chasms, and reclaimed by wild nature. But there's something alive there that it isn't present in other locations. An energy, a sense that the boundaries between forms are thinner, that what we consider fixed and stable could, at any moment, shift into something else. Giants appear to have had connections to the crucible. Their enormous bodies sometimes sprouted what's described as the mother of all crucibles, a massive tangle of horns and bone that some believe represents the crucible in its most concentrated form. The giant race, now extinct save for a few survivors, may have been among the first to be touched by the crucible's transformative power. Ancient dragons like Placidusax existed during what might be called the Age of the Crucible, or at least immediately before the Greater Will asserted dominance. Placidusax is remembered as an Elden Lord in a time before there were Elden Lords as we understand them, suggesting he might have been champion of whatever power the Crucible represented. While their connection is never explicitly stated, dragons with their scales and wings and ancient fury embody traits we see manifested as crucible powers, hinting at possible deep links to that primordial source. The misbegotten, those tragic servants and warriors found throughout the lands between, are directly stated to be products of the Crucible. Their bestial features, their wings, their connection to ancient life, all mark them as beings who should have been extinct, but persist because something in their lineage retained the Crucible's touch. They're called misbegotten because they were supposedly born from contact with the Crucible, as if proximity to that primordial force could reshape bloodlines. And then there are the Omen, Morgoth and Morg, twin sons of Queen Marika, born with horns and tails and condemned to the depths because of it. The Omen are perhaps the clearest example of the Crucible's persistence in the current age. They're called accursed, but their curse is simply that they manifest traits that were once considered blessings. They're evolutionary throwbacks, bearing characteristics that connect them to an age the Golden Order desperately wants to forget. The shadow of the Erdtree expansion reveals something crucial. Queen Marika herself came from a people who suffered under Hornsent persecution. Her own people, the shamans, were tortured by the Hornsent for lacking horns yet possessing golden grace, a form of blasphemy in Crucible worshipping culture. They were beaten, stuffed into jars, subjected to horrific rituals meant to extract the gold from their bodies or convert them into more acceptable forms. Marika's eventual revenge, her crusade led by Messmer the Impaler, was directed at the Hornsent specifically because of this connection. She didn't just conquer them, she tried to erase them. And part of that erasure involved elevating the Erdtree as something pure and ordered while demonizing everything connected to the Crucible, everything chaotic and primordial that came before. But here's the profound irony. The Erdtree is the Crucible, or rather, it grew from the Crucible. It's the same tree, transformed. The Greater Will didn't create a new source of life. It took the existing one, the Crucible, that had sustained life in the lands between since before memory, and reshaped it, refined it, ordered it, stripped away the chaos, and called the result divine. Multiple ancient texts refer to the Crucible as the primordial form of the Erdtree. Siluria's tree, the spear wielded by one of the Crucible Knights' greatest champions, is explicitly modeled after the Crucible and described as being close in nature to life itself. The Erdtree's roots still pulse with the Crucible's power. The blessings it grants, the grace it bestows, all of it flows from that ancient source. The transformation from Crucible to Erdtree represents more than just a change in appearance. It represents a fundamental shift in how life functions in the lands between. Where the Crucible allowed fluid boundaries between forms, the Erdtree enforces categories. Where the Crucible embraced chaos and variation, the Erdtree demands order and conformity. Where the Crucible blessed all forms of life equally, the Erdtree creates hierarchies. And those who remember the Crucible, those who retain its power, those who bear its marks on their bodies, they become problems to be dealt with. Anomalies, throwbacks, cursed. Which brings us to the warriors who served during that transition. The knights who wielded the Crucible's power when it was still honored. The elite warriors who channeled those primordial energies through their very armor, who manifested horns and tails and wings and breath, not as aberrations but as weapons. The order that served the first Elden Lord when he established the Erdtree, never imagining that the tree they helped plant would one day reject them for bearing the marks of the soil it grew from. The Crucible Knights, Godfrey's chosen warriors, champions of an age that exists now only in fragments and fading memory. Chapter 2: The Age of Godfrey. Birth of an elite order. Picture a man. Not a god, not yet, just a man, though calling him just anything undersells the reality. A chieftain from the Badlands, a warrior whose strength was so overwhelming that even his own bloodlust had to be caged. He took the beast regent Sarosh onto his back, a lion-like creature whose presence served to suppress the ceaseless battle fury that raged within him. Not because he was civilized, because civilization required someone who could direct violence rather than embody it constantly. This was Huara Lu, and when he became consort to Queen Marika, when he took up the mantle of the first Elden Lord, when he vowed to conduct himself as a lord should, he became Godfrey, and Godfrey needed an army worthy of the task before him, establishing the age of the Erdtree. The Crucible Knights were not conscripts. They were not soldiers recruited from peasant stock and trained to basic competence. They were elite warriors, each one exceptional, drawn to Godfrey's service by something more than simple duty. They understood what the Crucible was. They could channel its power. They wore armor imbued with its vitalic energies. They were, in essence, living embodiments of the primordial chaos that Godfrey was tasked with bringing under control. The irony is exquisite. To establish order, Godfrey employed chaos. To create the age of the Erdtree, he relied on warriors whose power came from the Erdtree's chaotic predecessor. The Crucible Knights were tools of transformation, agents who helped transition the lands between from one age to another, never realizing they would become casualties of that same transition. The exact number of Crucible Knights originally serving Godfrey is uncertain. Those 16 were mentioned in early accounts before that detail vanished from official records. What we know for certain is that these warriors of Godfrey were united in purpose, divided into distinct factions under two legendary leaders. The Realm of Shadow would later reveal Devonia, a knight whose story would diverge from the others in crucial ways. These knights wore distinctive armor, not the golden plate of later Erdtree champions, but something different. Reddish gold, that primordial color that betrays the Crucible's influence. The metal itself seemed alive, imbued with the vitalic power they channeled. A torrent of life design was emblazoned on their armor, a pattern suggesting constant flow, perpetual motion, the churning energy of the Crucible made visible. Their weapons were forged from the same primordial gold, great swords that hummed with ancient holiness. spears modeled after the crucible itself, shields bearing the marks of their order, hammers engraved with torrents of life. Every piece of equipment wasn't just carried by the knights, it channeled the crucible's power, served as a conduit for those primal energies. And this is crucial. Their armor held the power of the crucible, not metaphorically, actually held it. The vitalic force they drew from inhabited their very equipment. When a crucible knight manifested horns or a tail or fiery breath, they weren't casting a spell in the way a sorcerer might. They were allowing the crucible's power, stored in their armor, to manifest through their bodies. They were temporary vessels for primordial forces, warriors who could become partially bestial at will. Godfrey's wars were legendary. He led campaigns against the giants, that ancient race whose connection to the crucible was so strong they literally grew crucibles from their bodies. He faced the Storm Lord alone, a feat that became the stuff of legend. His golden armies remained unvanquished and unbowed through countless battles. And at the forefront of these campaigns were his Crucible Knights, warriors whose bestial powers made them devastating on the battlefield. Imagine facing one in combat. You're a warrior, perhaps skilled, perhaps even renowned. You engage this knight in their red-gold armor. They're formidable, certainly, but manageable. You trade blows. You watch for patterns. You find your opening. And then they manifest horns. Suddenly, you're dealing with a goring charge that launches you into the air, a shoulder-mounted horn that appears from nowhere and strikes with force that breaks through shields. Or perhaps they grow a tail, a supple appendage covered in scales that sweeps through multiple foes in a single rotation. Or their neck swells with a throat pouch and they breathe fire while walking towards you. An unholy fusion of human technique and draconic power. This was what it meant to face a Crucible Knight. They were unpredictable in ways that standard warriors couldn't match. Their armor gave them abilities that shouldn't exist. They embodied the chaos of the Crucible while maintaining the discipline of trained soldiers. Perfect weapons for Godfrey's wars of conquest. The knights organized themselves around two central figures, two leaders who became legendary within the order and beyond it. These weren't just skilled fighters. These were warriors honored as foremost among an already elite group, champions among champions. And they divided the Crucible Knights into distinct factions based on their combat styles and symbolic allegiances. First, there was Ordovis, the leader of those who wore armor adorned with axe ornamentation as a mark of respect for Godfrey's preferred weapon. Ordovis wielded a greatsword, massive and elegant, forged from primordial gold and crackling with the Crucible's power. His knights followed his example, carrying greatswords and heavy shields emblazoned with the Crucible's mark. They fought with overwhelming force, manifesting horns and fiery breath to break enemy formations and shatter defenses. The axe symbolism was deliberate. Godfrey's great axe, the weapon he carried before it broke during the Long March, became an emblem of the golden lineage. Ordovis and his faction aligned themselves with this symbol, positioning themselves as extensions of Godfrey's will. They were the hammer to his anvil, the force that executed his strategic vision through raw power and unrelenting assault. Second, there was Siluria, the leader of those who wore armor adorned with great tree ornamentation. Siluria wielded a great spear, Siluria's tree itself, a weapon explicitly modeled after the Crucible's form. Her knights carried similar spears, channeling the Crucible's power through weapons that emphasized reach and precision over raw force. They manifested horns in combat, goring enemies from unexpected angles, using their mobility and tactical awareness to complement their counterparts' direct approach. The tree symbolism is fascinating because it represents the Crucible itself. Where Ordovis aligned his faction with Godfrey personally, Siluria aligned hers with the primordial source of their power. The tree design wasn't about the Erdtree specifically, not yet. It was about the Crucible as a tree, as a branching structure from which all life emerged. Her faction embodied this more directly, positioning themselves as defenders of the Crucible's legacy even as they fought to establish its successor. Together, Ordovis and Siluria commanded an organization that was devastatingly effective. One faction provided overwhelming frontal assault. The other offered tactical flexibility and sustained pressure. Both groups could manifest Crucible powers that made them far more dangerous than their numbers suggested, and both served Godfrey with unwavering loyalty. But there was another knight, one who didn't fit into either faction, one who would outlast them all, and whose quest would lead to the realm of shadow itself. Devonia's story we'll explore soon enough, but for now, understand that even among the Crucible Knights, there were those who walked solitary paths. The Crucible Knights were instrumental in establishing the Erdtree's dominance. They fought alongside Godfrey in every major campaign. They were there when the giants fell. They were there when the Stormlord was defeated. They were there for all the victories that made Godfrey's reign possible. They helped transform the lands between from a place of chaotic, unstructured power into something organized under the greater will's authority. And this is where tragedy begins to take shape, because the very success of their mission contained the seeds of their downfall. The Erdtree they helped establish would eventually flourish to the point where its origin became inconvenient. The order they helped create would mature into something that viewed their chaos as threatening. The civilization they fought to build would come to see them as relics of a barbaric past rather than honored veterans. For a time, though, they were celebrated. Godfrey's Crucible Knights, warriors whose bestial powers were respected as divine gifts, champions of the first Elden Lord, heroes of the wars that forged the Golden Order. They stood at the pinnacle of martial achievement in the lands between, second only to Godfrey himself. But Godfrey wouldn't last forever, and when he fell, when Queen Marika divested him of grace and exiled him to the Badlands with his tarnished followers, the Crucible Knights would face a terrible choice: abandon their lord or remain in a world that no longer wanted them. Most chose to remain, and that choice would define the rest of their existence. Chapter 3: Champions of the Primordial, Ordovis and Siluria. Legends aren't born, they're forged through accomplishments so significant that names persist long after they should have been forgotten. Through mastery so complete that weapons, armor, and fighting styles become templates that others study and emulate. Through dedication so absolute that fame transcends lifetimes to become permanent fixtures in history. Ordovis and Siluria were such warriors, and understanding them means understanding what the Crucible Knights represented at their peak. Ordovis, leader of the Axe Knights. His name echoes an age of transformation, the Ordovician period when life was beginning to diversify explosively, when the first land plants appeared, when marine life flourished in unprecedented variety, an age of transformation and change. The naming wasn't accidental. It connects Ordovis to deep time, to an age so distant that modern civilization can barely comprehend it. He represents living prehistory, a remnant of an era that predates the current world order by eons. His weapon was Ordovis's greatsword, massive, elegant, forged from that distinctive primordial gold with its reddish tinge. The blade hummed with power even when still. When swung with intent, it could generate a crucible tornado, a swirling manifestation of the crucible's chaotic energies made into a weapon. The vortex tore through enemies with wind and power, a visual representation of the torrent of life that the crucible represents. His armor bore the axe ornamentation that marked him and his followers. This wasn't decorative. It was a statement of purpose and allegiance. The axe was Godfrey's symbol before it became an emblem of the golden lineage. By wearing this mark, Ordovis and his knights declared themselves extensions of Godfrey's will, warriors who carried out their lord's commands with the same devastating force that Godfrey himself brought to battle. The knights under Ordovis's command fought with a particular ferocity. They were the shock troops, the heavy assault force that broke enemy lines through overwhelming power. They wielded great swords that could cleave through armor and flesh with equal ease. They carried thick shields that could weather tremendous punishment. And when the moment was right, they would manifest horns to finish weakened enemies or turn desperate situations in their favor. The horn charge became synonymous with their fighting style. Brutal, effective, terrifying. Enemies who thought they'd created distance would find that distance closed instantly by a knight who had temporarily become part beast. Ordovis's leadership appears to have emphasized discipline and direct action. His knights operated with military precision, executing complex maneuvers while maintaining the flexibility to adapt when situations changed. They were professional soldiers who happened to channel primordial chaos, a combination that made them exceptionally dangerous. Now consider Siluria, leader of the Tree Knights, named after the Silurian period, which followed the Ordovician and lasted until approximately 419 million years ago. This was an age when life began conquering land in earnest, when the first vascular plants appeared, when insects and arachnids emerged. An age of growth and expansion, of life pushing into new territories. Where Ordovis represents the diversification of life, Siluria represents its expansion and establishment. Her name connects her to an age of growth, of consolidation, of life forms developing the structures that would allow them to colonize environments previously considered hostile. Siluria wielded Siluria's tree, a great spear explicitly described as being modeled after the crucible itself. The weapon was imbued with ancient holy essence, and its very form was meant to represent the Primordial Erdtree in its crucible state. Where Ordovis's greatsword channeled the crucible's power through devastating strikes, Siluria's spear embodied the crucible's form, a physical representation of the torrent of life made manifest. Her armor bore the great tree ornamentation that marked her and her followers. This reveals a different relationship to the crucible than what Ordovis represented. Where he aligned with Godfrey personally, Siluria aligned with the source itself. The tree symbol predates the Erdtree as we know it. It refers to the crucible in its role as the wellspring of life, the branching structure from which all diversity emerged. The knights under Siluria's command fought differently than their counterparts. They emphasized mobility and reach. The Great Spear allowed them to strike from positions where enemies' shorter weapons couldn't retaliate. They could maintain pressure without committing fully to engagements, poking and prodding at defenses until weaknesses appeared. And when those weaknesses manifested, they would close in with manifested horns, using the goring charge to exploit openings with lethal precision. Siluria's leadership style appears to have been more strategic, more focused on positioning and timing. Her knights needed to understand spacing, needed to recognize when to press and when to withdraw. They were tacticians as much as warriors, fighters who thought several moves ahead. This complemented the other faction perfectly. Where one broke through enemy lines, the other exploited the chaos that followed. Together, these two leaders created a balanced force. One faction was the hammer, the other was the spear. Both could manifest crucible powers that made them unpredictable. Both served Godfrey with complete loyalty, and both were honored as foremost among the Crucible Knights, celebrated within the Order and feared by its enemies. Their relationship to each other remains somewhat mysterious. Were they rivals, partners, friends? History doesn't specify, but there's no indication of conflict between the factions. The divisions appear to have been tactical rather than political, different tools for different situations, different approaches to achieving the same goals. What we know for certain is that both survived long enough to see Godfrey exiled. Both chose to remain in the lands between rather than follow their lord into banishment. And both scattered to different locations when the Order lost its cohesion. Ordovis eventually ending up in the Orisa hero's grave near Leyndell, Siluria, making her way to the deep-root depths beneath the capital. Those locations tell us something about their mindsets after the collapse. Ordovis remained close to the capital, as if guarding it or waiting for something. Siluria went deeper, to a place where the Erdtree's roots touched ancient structures, where the great tree's connection to its primordial origins was most visible. Both maintained their vigils. Both continued existing as Crucible Knights, even as the age that created them faded into history. When encountered centuries later, when faced by those who would challenge them, they still fight with discipline. They still manifest their powers with control and precision. They demonstrate that they remain elite warriors, still masters of their craft, still worthy of respect, even if the world refuses to grant it. Their equipment can be claimed after their defeat. Ordovis's greatsword, with its devastating vortex technique, Siluria's tree, embodying the Crucible's form, the armor sets bearing their respective marks. These aren't just powerful relics, they're artifacts from an age the Golden Order wants to forget. Physical proof that the Erdtree's foundation was built on chaos rather than divine purity. The fact that both leaders were named after sequential geological periods suggests they understood their role in a larger timeline. Ordovis, from the Ordovician, representing life's diversification. Siluria, from the Silurian, representing life's expansion. They were part of a continuum, links in a chain stretching back to the very beginning of life itself and forward to whatever would come after. But there was a third, named Crucible Knight, one who came after the Devonian period, the age that followed the Silurian, one who would outlast both Ordovis and Siluria, who would serve longer than any other member of the Order, who would ultimately leave the lands between entirely in search of something the others had given up on finding. Devonia, the longest serving of the Crucible Knights, the hammer wielder who walked alone, and whose quest would lead to discoveries that the Golden Order desperately hoped would stay buried. Chapter 4. The Lone Seeker, Devonia's Quest. Most stories about military orders focus on the leaders, the charismatic commanders, the tactical geniuses, the warriors whose names become synonymous with victory. That makes sense. Those are the individuals who shape the organization's destiny, who make decisions that determine whether it thrives or collapses, who embody whatever ideals the Order claims to represent. But sometimes, the most interesting figure is the one who doesn't fit the mold. The outlier, the individual who serves the same cause as everyone else, but walks a different path, asks different questions, seeks different answers. The one whose loyalty is unquestionable, but whose methods are peculiar. The one who outlasts the legends because they're motivated by something deeper than glory or duty. Devonia was that figure for the Crucible Knights, named after the Devonian period, which lasted from approximately 419 million years ago to 359 million years ago. This was the age when fish diversified explosively, when the first tetrapods crawled from water onto land, when forests began spreading across continents. An age of transition, when life was learning to exist in environments that had previously been impossible to inhabit. The choice of name is perfect for Devonia's story, where Ordovis represented diversification and Siluria represented expansion. Devonia represents transition and exploration, the movement from one state to another, the courage required to leave behind everything familiar and venture into the unknown. Devonia was the longest-serving member of the Crucible Knights. This warrior served under Godfrey throughout his entire reign as first Elden Lord, was there for every major campaign, every significant victory, every transformation the lands between underwent as the age of the Erdtree was established, witnessed the organization at its peak, and watched it decline after Godfrey's exile, saw companions scattered, saw the Order lose cohesion, saw the world they'd helped create turn against them, and still served, still maintained the vigil, still embodied what it meant to be a Crucible Knight long after most had abandoned that identity or been killed defending it. Unlike Ordovis with his great sword, or Siluria with her spear, Devonia wielded a great hammer. This is significant. The hammer is fundamentally different from bladed weapons. It's a tool as much as a weapon, associated with construction and crafting, rather than pure destruction. The Crucible's connection to smithing and transformation is reinforced by Devonia's choice of armament. Devonia's hammer was forged of primordial gold, marked by its reddish hue, and inhabited by ancient holiness. A torrent of life was engraved upon the striking face, making explicit the connection between the weapon and the Crucible's nature. When swung with the proper technique, the hammer creates a crucible tornado, similar to what Ordovis's greatsword produces, demonstrating that different weapons can channel the same fundamental power. Devonia's helm is unique among the Crucible Knights. Where Ordovis wore the axe ornamentation and Siluria wore the tree ornamentation, Devonia's helm bears a hammer-shaped crest. This warrior didn't align with either faction, didn't declare allegiance to Godfrey's personal symbol or the Crucible's tree form. The hammer symbolism suggests something different: transformation through force, reshaping through impact, the act of forging new forms from raw material. And Devonia did something no other Crucible Knight is recorded doing: left the lands between entirely. Ancient records tell us that Devonia quested in search of the Crucible's origin, departing from the lands of the Erdtree alone. This wasn't exile or fleeing persecution. It appears to have been deliberate choice, a conscious decision to abandon everything familiar, to leave behind the world the Crucible Knights had helped establish, to venture into the realm of shadow in pursuit of knowledge that most had given up on acquiring. Think about the implications. The other Crucible Knights, after Godfrey's exile, either remained loyal to the Erdtree in some capacity, sought new lords to serve, or simply maintained silent vigils in isolated locations. They adapted to their changed circumstances. They found ways to persist in a world that no longer wanted them. Devonia rejected all of that. Instead of adapting to the new reality, this warrior decided to investigate the old one, to trace the Crucible back to its source, to understand where that primordial power actually came from, what it represented, why it manifested the way it did. Based on where this quest led, it seems Devonia wanted to answer questions that apparently no one else was even asking anymore. The journey led to the ancient ruins of Rao. These ruins, located in the realm of shadow and accessible only by traveling through Shadow Keep, are described as a place where the power of the Crucible once flourished. They're ancient beyond measure, overgrown and flooded, split by chasms and reclaimed by wild nature. But there's something there, some lingering presence of that primordial force, some echo of what the Crucible was at its height. Devonia reached these ruins and remained there, set up position on a rock overlooking the flooded structures, and fixated gaze upon the distant gate of divinity atop the veiled tower of Enir Ilim. Ancient descriptions make this explicit. Devonia was looking at something, studying it, waiting for it. The gate of divinity, whatever it represents, held significance for this warrior's quest. Now there's Devonia's unique ability, the one transformation we witness but cannot learn. During encounters at the ancient ruins of Rao, Devonia transforms. The knight's lower body becomes something else entirely, a pachyderm centaur with 6 limbs, 4 back legs, resembling those of even-toed ungulates, and front legs terminating in large hands with opposable thumbs. It's bizarre, powerful, and unlike anything the other Crucible Knights manifest. This isn't horns or tail or wings or breath. This is complete bodily transformation, a metamorphosis that turns Devonia from a humanoid warrior into something fundamentally different. It's the Crucible's power taken to an extreme that suggests either greater mastery than other knights achieved or willingness to embrace the chaos more completely. The transformation connects to Devonia's naming in a fascinating way. The Devonian period was when tetrapods first appeared, when vertebrates made the transition from water to land. It was an age of limbs developing, of bodies adapting to environments that required new forms of movement. Devonia's centaur transformation, with its emphasis on multiple limbs and hybrid body structure, echoes this evolutionary milestone. But here's what makes Devonia's story truly significant. This quest for the Crucible's origin appears to have progressed further than anyone else's attempts. The evidence suggests Devonia found lost powers at the ancient ruins of Rao, discovered abilities that even other Crucible Knights didn't know existed. This indicates that Rao likely holds genuine secrets about the Crucible's nature, that whatever flourished there represents the power in a form closer to its source than what exists elsewhere. The presence of the Hornsent civilization in the realm of shadow becomes relevant here. The Hornsent worshipped the Crucible, built their entire culture around it, created rituals and practices designed to channel its power and honor its nature. The ancient ruins of Rao are Hornsent territory, places where their understanding of the Crucible was expressed through architecture and ritual and daily life. Devonia traveling there suggests recognition that the lands between, under the Golden Order's influence, had lost crucial knowledge about the Crucible, that to understand it truly, one had to go beyond the Erdtree's reach, into territories where the original understanding persisted. The Hornsent might be brutal and alien by Golden Order standards, but they remembered what the Crucible actually was. They hadn't rewritten its history or demonized its manifestations. They celebrated it, worshipped it, built everything around it. And the gate of divinity that Devonia stared at, the veiled tower of Enir Ilim that drew this warrior's focus. These are Hornsent constructions, places of significance in their theology and cosmology. Devonia wasn't just seeking the Crucible's origin in an abstract sense. This warrior was studying Hornsent sacred geography, examining their holy sites, trying to understand what they understood about the force that both cultures were connected to. The tragedy of Devonia's quest is that it appears unfinished. We encounter this knight at the ancient ruins of Rao, still maintaining position, still watching the gate of divinity, still seeking. Whether Devonia found what was being searched for, whether the quest's goal was achieved or remained perpetually out of reach, we don't know. What we know is that even after untold years of searching, even after traveling farther than any other Crucible Knight, even after discovering lost powers and reaching territories where the Crucible's energy still flourished, the quest continued. Perhaps that's fitting. The Crucible, by its nature, resists simple understanding. It's the wellspring of all life, the place where everything was blended together, the source from which infinite variation emerged. How do you find the origin of something like that? How do you trace endless diversity back to a single point? How do you comprehend chaos that predates thought itself? Devonia's quest might have been impossible from the start, but the attempt itself is significant. It demonstrates that even after centuries of suppression, even after everyone else has given up or adapted or died, someone still cares enough about the truth to pursue it alone, without support, beyond the reach of the civilization that once celebrated them. That's what Devonia ultimately represents: persistence in the face of abandonment, dedication to ideals when the world has moved on, maintenance of truth when lies are more convenient. Not a hero who wins grand victories or reshapes reality. Simply a warrior who endures, who maintains standards, who continues being what they've always been, even when being that brings scorn instead of celebration. When Devonia is finally defeated, when the hammer and the unique helm are claimed, more than just powerful equipment is inherited. It's the legacy of the longest quest any Crucible Knight ever undertook. Proof that even after everything, even after abandonment and exile and the world turning hostile, some warriors never stopped searching for truth. But before we can fully understand what the Crucible Knights protected, before we can appreciate what Devonia sought in the realm of shadow, we need to examine the powers themselves, the transformations that made the Knights so formidable and eventually marked them as problems to be scorned. Chapter 5. Powers of the Primordial, the Crucible's gifts. There are many forms of power in the lands between. Sorceries that manipulate gravity and stars and cosmic forces. Incantations that call upon divine authority, channel the flames of ancient gods, or harness entropy itself. Dragon magic that allows mortals to breathe elements. Golden Order fundamentalism that enforces law through faith. But the powers drawn from the Crucible are different. They're not manipulation of external forces or calling upon distant deities. They're transformations, temporary reshapings of the body to manifest traits that once were common, that existed when all life was blended together, that remain latent in living flesh even after millions of years of evolution have supposedly refined them away. When a Crucible Knight manifests horns, they're not creating something from nothing. They're allowing something that already exists, something encoded in the deepest parts of their biology, to briefly surface. The Crucible's power, stored in their armor and channeled through their will, permits this. For a moment, the boundaries between forms become fluid again. For a moment, the Knight becomes partially something else, something more primal. First among these is the manifestation of horns. The caster creates a mighty horn on their shoulder and charges forward, goring enemies from a low stance. When channeled with focus, the attack travels further and launches even large opponents into the air with tremendous force. Horns are fundamental to understanding the Crucible. They appear on omen, on hornscent, on ancient beasts, on creatures that retain that primordial connection. They're not decorative. They're weapons, tools, declarations of strength. In nature, horns serve multiple purposes: combat, defense, display, territory marking. They're permanent features in most species that have them. But Crucible Knights don't have permanent horns. They manifest them temporarily, calling them forth when needed and dismissing them when the task is complete. This suggests incredible control over the body's form, the ability to shift between states at will. Its evolution compressed into seconds, weaponized and refined. The horn doesn't appear randomly. It grows from the shoulder, positioned perfectly for a charging attack. The knight's body knows how to use it instinctively, doesn't need to learn a new combat style to accommodate this sudden appendage. This implies the knowledge of how to use horns is already present, already encoded, just waiting for the right conditions to express itself. Then there's the manifesting of tails. This creates a supple appendage covered in scales or spikes that sweeps through foes in a wide arc. When channeled with greater intent, it performs a second sweep with even greater force and reach. The tail functions as a natural weapon, turning the knight's body into a threat from every angle. Tails are ancient. Most vertebrates either have them or evolved from ancestors that did. They provide balance, communication, defense, and in some cases, offensive capability. Humans and most primates lost their tails through evolution, but the genetic information remains. Occasionally, vestigial tails appear even now, evolutionary echoes that demonstrate the trait never truly disappeared. The Crucible Knight's manifested tail isn't vestigial. It's fully functional, powerful, deadly. It suggests that the genetic memory of having tails, of using them effectively in combat and movement, persists despite millions of years of evolution selecting against them. The Crucible's power accesses that memory and makes it real again. The scales that sometimes cover the tail connect it to reptilian forms, dragons, ancient serpents, creatures that existed in the age when the Crucible flourished. The tail links its user to that prehistoric past, makes them temporarily draconic in a way that's distinct from dragon communion, but draws from similar sources. Another power manifests as fiery breath. This creates a throat pouch, similar to what basilisks and certain amphibians possess, that allows the caster to spew flames while walking. Greater focus extends the duration of the breath, turning the knight into a mobile inferno. Fire breath is perhaps the most obviously draconic of the Crucible's gifts. Dragons defined ancient power in the lands between. Placidusax, the ancient dragon lord who predates even Godfrey's reign, was Elden Lord in a time before the Greater Will established dominance. While their connection is never explicitly stated, dragons and the Crucible share such antiquity that some link between them seems plausible. The throat pouch is fascinating from a biological perspective. It's not just aesthetic. Certain animals develop throat pouches for various purposes: sound, amplification in frogs, display in lizards, storage in pelicans. But a throat pouch specifically for generating and expelling fire? That's purely fantastical, a biological impossibility made real through the Crucible's power. Yet the Crucible Knights manifest it as naturally as they manifest horns or tails. The body accepts this impossible modification. creates the necessary structures, generates the flames, expels them with force and accuracy. It's magic masquerading as biology, or perhaps biology that remembers a time when magic and nature were indistinguishable. Wings appear in some manifestations, though we see them demonstrated more than learned. Golden feathers that allow brief flight or powerful aerial strikes. They connect the knights to avian forms, to creatures that conquered the air as tetrapods conquered the land. Wings represent ultimate freedom of movement. Flight has evolved independently multiple times throughout Earth's history. Insects, pterosaurs, birds, bats. It's such an advantageous trait that life keeps rediscovering it through different paths. The crucible, as the wellspring of all forms, would naturally include flight among its gifts. The wings that manifest aren't permanent. They don't allow sustained flight, but they provide enough lift and power for devastating aerial attacks, for repositioning mid-combat, for demonstrating that the boundaries of form extend even to the realm of air. In the realm of shadow, newer manifestations were discovered. Bloom creates an explosive burst of golden energy from the caster's body, dealing devastation in a wide radius. Its flowering weaponized, growth turned violent, the act of blossoming transformed into an attack. Flowering is life's reproductive strategy made visible. Plants bloom to attract pollinators, to spread genetic material, to ensure the next generation. Weaponizing that process suggests the Crucible understood that creation and destruction are intimately linked, that growth requires sacrifice, that beauty and violence can emerge from the same source. Thorns manifest as protrusions that damage those who strike the caster, turning defense into offense. Protection through deterrence, the plant kingdom's survival strategy adapted for combat. Thorns are evolution's answer to predation. Plants can't run, can't fight in traditional ways, so they developed features that make consuming them painful or dangerous. The Crucible, incorporating thorns, demonstrates that it drew from plant life as much as animal life, that all living strategies were part of its repertoire. Together, these powers paint a picture of what the Crucible actually was, not a specific creature or form, but a state where all traits were accessible, where boundaries between kingdoms and species didn't meaningfully exist. A Crucible Knight, manifesting horns and tails and wings and breath and flowers and thorns, isn't switching between different spells. They are accessing different facets of the same fundamental power, the same primordial state where their body could be anything, because everything was connected. The armor strengthens these manifestations. The sets forged from primordial gold provide enhancements to the powers they channel. This isn't just coincidence. It represents the armor's role as a storage vessel for crucible power. The primordial gold that forms the armor literally holds the vitalic energy that the knight channels. Wearing more pieces means more stored power, stronger manifestations, deeper connection to that ancient source. What makes these abilities truly remarkable is their efficiency. They don't demand excessive resources. They don't require impossible investments of talent or training beyond what the knights already possess. They're designed to be practical combat tools, not flashy displays. This pragmatism reflects the Crucible itself. Life doesn't waste energy on unnecessary features. Everything serves a purpose. Every trait provides an advantage. or it gets selected against. The Crucible Knights understood this. Their powers weren't chosen for aesthetic appeal or theatrical impact. Horns for charging and breaking formations, tails for controlling space and denying areas, breath for sustained pressure and zone control, wings for mobility and aerial superiority. Each manifestation addressed specific tactical needs, filled particular roles within their combat doctrine. But here's the tragedy. These same abilities eventually became marks of shame. As the Golden Order matured, as the Erdtree's influence solidified, as memory of the Crucible faded, people began viewing these manifestations differently, not as divine gifts, but as chaotic aberrations, not as proof of connection to life's source, but as evidence of corruption. The gauntlets worn by these knights tell us explicitly, in time, the strength shown by these knights, and even their appearance, was seen as chaotic and deserving of scorn. The powers that once made them heroes became reasons to exile them. The abilities that established the Erdtree became embarrassments once that establishment was complete. This shift in perception wasn't random. It was deliberate policy. The Golden Order needed to establish the Erdtree as something pure, something that emerged from divine will rather than from a primordial soup of chaotic life. Acknowledging the Crucible meant acknowledging that the Erdtree's foundation was chaos, that order was built on disorder, that the refined present grew from a wild past. So the Crucible had to be forgotten, or rather, remembered only as something primitive and inferior. The powers that Crucible Knights manifested had to be reframed as monstrous rather than miraculous. The Knights themselves had to be marginalized, their contributions minimized, their very existence treated as an unfortunate necessity that had thankfully passed. But the power remained. The abilities could still be learned by those willing to seek them out, to face Crucible Knights and understand their techniques. The knowledge persisted despite attempts to suppress it. And in the modern age, in the time when tarnished walk the lands between, these ancient powers are available again to those who understand their significance. When these manifestations are employed, when horns sprout or tails sweep or flames pour forth, it's not just technique being used, it's brief access to that primordial state where all life was blended together. It's allowing the body to remember forms it hasn't worn in eons. It's channeling the same power that shaped the lands between before the greater will imposed its order. It's becoming, for just a moment, what the Crucible Knights were, living bridges between the ancient past and the regulated present, warriors who embodied chaos in service of order, proof that what the Golden Order calls cursed was once, and perhaps still is, divine. Chapter 6. The Haunsant, Keepers of Crucible. Truth. To understand the Crucible fully, to grasp what it meant before the Golden Order sanitized its history, we must look beyond the lands between. We must examine a civilization that never underwent that transformation, that maintained their Crucible worship, even as the Erdtree grew to dominance elsewhere. We must enter the realm of shadow and meet the Haunsant. The Haunsant were, or perhaps still are, in diminished form, the dominant civilization in the realm of shadow. They built great towers like Belorat and Enir Ilim. They established sophisticated, cultural practices and religious rituals, they accumulated knowledge about multiple divine powers and integrated different forms of authority into their society. They weren't primitive, they weren't backwards, they were advanced, organized, powerful. And they worshipped the crucible absolutely. To the hornsent, horns weren't deformities or curses. They were sublime artifacts, divine gifts, irrefutable proof of being chosen by the crucible itself. Not just any horns, but specifically tangled horns, the kind that form when horns are repeatedly broken and regrown, creating complex spiraled patterns. These spiral tangled horns were viewed as symbols of primacy, evidence that the bearer was particularly blessed. The logic reveals their worldview. If horns are good, then more complex horns must be better. Tangles represent multiple generations of growth, damage, and regeneration. They're proof that the crucible's power is strong enough to heal and rebuild, that the connection persists despite injury. In hornsent culture, someone with simple horns might be respected, but someone with massively tangled horns was approaching the divine. This created a strict hierarchy. Those born with prominent, tangled horns held positions of power and prestige. Those with smaller or simpler horns occupied middle positions. And those without horns at all? They were problems. The shamans, Marika's people, had no horns. But they did have something the hornsent coveted: gold. Not metaphorical gold, but actual golden essence in their bodies, connected to the primordial crucible but manifest differently than horns. To the hornsent, this was blasphemy. How could beings without horns possess the crucible's blessing? How could they channel its power in a form that didn't conform to hornsent understanding? The answer the hornsent arrived at was brutal. The shamans needed to be corrected, converted, forced into proper relationship with the crucible through suffering and transformation. They developed rituals of torture and imprisonment, using implements like the tooth whip to flay flesh and extract that golden essence. They would beat shamans to pulp, take what they could from the bodies, then stuff the remains into jars. These jars, the living jars we encounter throughout the lands, have a far darker origin than might be initially realized. They weren't created benevolently. They were forced amalgamations of tortured flesh. Hornsent attempts to recreate the crucible's blending of forms through violence. The idea was that by mixing people together in jars, they could be reborn as better forms, more acceptable to the crucible, more aligned with hornsent theology. The shamans called this process sainthood, a term that appears in hornsent dialogue with deeply ironic undertones. Whether this was their own term used tragically or hornsent mockery remains ambiguous. But the practice itself is clear from ancient texts and environmental evidence. It was systematic destruction of a people who had the misfortune of manifesting crucible power in ways the dominant culture couldn't accommodate. Queen Marika came from the shamans. Her village can still be found in the realm of shadow, the shaman village, a peaceful place that was systematically emptied by hornsent persecution. Her people were taken, tortured, stuffed into jars. Her culture was targeted for elimination or conversion, and she watched it happen, too young or too powerless to stop it, until she wasn't powerless anymore. The details of Marika's ascension remain mysterious. How a shaman girl became an Empyrean, how she gained the favor of the Two Fingers and the Greater Will, how she transformed from victim to god, history doesn't fully explain. But what's clear is that once Marika had power, once she became queen and could command armies, she remembered what had been done to her people, and she sent Mesmer. Mesmer the Impaler, Marika's son, led a crusade into the realm of shadow. This wasn't a normal war of conquest. This was extermination. Systematic destruction of Hornsent civilization, burning of their towers, slaughter of their people, deliberate eradication of everything they'd built. Mesmer became known as the Impaler because of how thoroughly he destroyed the Hornsent, leaving their bodies on spikes as warnings and monuments to their defeat. The crusade was so successful that the Hornsent effectively ceased to exist as a civilization. Their great towers were ruined. Their population was devastated. Their culture was shattered. Those who survived were scattered, hiding in the ruins of what they'd built, no longer the dominant force in the realm of shadow, but desperate remnants clinging to fragments of their former glory. This is crucial for understanding why Marika appears to have hated the Crucible's manifestations. Based on what we learn about her past, it seems deeply rooted in trauma. The Hornsent had worshipped the Crucible, had built their entire civilization around it, had used that worship to justify torturing her people. Every horn she saw would have reminded her of Hornsent oppression. Every manifestation of Crucible power likely evoked memories of shamans being beaten and stuffed into jars. When Morgoth and Mog were born with horns, when they manifested clear Crucible traits, the evidence suggests Marika couldn't see them as blessed. She may have seen them as marked by the same power the Hornsent had weaponized against her people. She sealed them in the subterranean shunning grounds, and while we can't know her exact thoughts, the location and treatment speaks to deep revulsion, not because they were inherently cursed, but because their existence appears to have brought back unbearable memories. The same logic applied to all omen. Anyone born with horns was treated as accursed because horns were what the Hornsent had celebrated, what they'd used as justification for persecution. The Golden Order's rejection of Crucible traits wasn't based on those traits being genuinely harmful. It was based on Marika's trauma being codified into religious law, and the Crucible Knights got caught in this. They'd served Godfrey, Marika's first consort. They'd helped establish the Erdtree, Marika's symbol of authority. They'd fought her wars and won her victories. But they manifested horns and tails and wings and breath. They channeled the same power the Hornsent had worshipped. They represented, in their very being, the source of Marika's greatest pain. So they had to be marginalized, not openly destroyed. That would be ungrateful after their service, but scorned, treated as chaotic, scattered and forgotten, made into embarrassments rather than heroes. Their contributions acknowledged in the past tense, while their continued existence was quietly discouraged. The Hornsent's legacy shaped the entire age of the Erdtree in ways they never intended. By torturing the shamans, they created an enemy who would eventually destroy them. By celebrating the Crucible through oppression, they ensured that when their victim gained power, she would turn against everything the Crucible represented. Their theology of divine horns became the foundation for the Golden Order's persecution of Omen. And here's the profound irony. The Hornsent's understanding of the Crucible itself was likely more accurate than what the Golden Order would later claim. Their recognition of horns as divine gifts, their belief that tangled horns represented deeper connection to primordial power, their celebration of the Crucible rather than its suppression, all of this aligns more closely with what the Crucible actually appears to be based on the evidence we see throughout history. They understood the theology, one could argue, but were catastrophically wrong about the ethics. They recognized divine power in physical traits, but then tortured anyone whose traits didn't match their expectations. Truth wedded to cruelty, accurate cosmology married to monstrous practice. The Scadutree in the realm of shadow appears to be closely connected to the Crucible itself, possibly representing it in its original, almost primal form, a great tree that the Hornsent gathered around and drew power from, collecting its sap in great chalices as if trying to capture that primordial essence directly. Their rituals and practices all oriented around this tree and the Crucible power it represented. When Messmer's crusade came, when the flames consumed Hornsent civilization, the Scadutree was left standing. You can't burn the Crucible. You can't destroy the source of all life through simple violence. But you can suppress it, reinterpret it, transform it into something more controlled, which is exactly what Marika did in the lands between with the Erdtree. The ancient ruins of Rao, where Devonia the Crucible Knight eventually arrived, were Hornsent territory, a place where Crucible power flourished, where the ancient understanding of that primordial force was practiced and preserved. Devonia seeking the Crucible's origin and ending up in Hornsent lands suggests recognition that whatever truth the Golden Order had buried, the Hornsent had maintained. Not that the Hornsent were good. History makes clear they were capable of tremendous cruelty, that their treatment of the shamans was inexcusable, that their rigid hierarchy based on physical traits was deeply unjust. But they understood something true about the Crucible that the Golden Order worked hard to forget. And that truth, preserved in their ruins and rituals, remained accessible to those willing to look for it. The Hornsent we encounter in the realm of shadow embodies this complicated legacy. He seeks revenge for what Messmer did to his people. He wants to kill Marika, her offspring, all denizens of the Erdtree. His rage is understandable, given that his entire civilization was destroyed. But he's also perpetuating the cycle of violence that defined Hornsent shaman relations, unable to see beyond tribal vengeance to larger truths about power and trauma. The Crucible sits at the center of all of this. The Hornsent worshipped it and used that worship to justify oppression. Marika was victimized by that oppression and turned against the Crucible itself. The Crucible Knights served Marika, but retained the Crucible's power, and thus became victims of her trauma-driven policies. The Omen bore Crucible traits and suffered for it. The Misbegotten manifested Crucible features and were enslaved. On and on, cascading consequences, all traceable back to how different cultures tried to understand and control primordial power. And through it all, the Crucible itself remains morally neutral. It's not good or evil. It's the wellspring of life, the source from which diversity emerges, the state where all forms were possible. How people use that understanding, what they do with access to its power, the social structures they build around it, those are where morality enters. The Hornsent used it to oppress. Marika used rejection of it to consolidate authority. The Crucible Knights tried to honor it through discipline and service. The omens suffer from its manifestation through no fault of their own. Same source, radically different outcomes. Understanding the Hornsent is key to understanding why the Crucible Knights fell from grace. It wasn't just that they were old-fashioned or that the Golden Order wanted to modernize. It was that Marika literally may not have been able to bear seeing Crucible power celebrated, could not tolerate manifestations of traits that reminded her of her people's tormentors. The Knights were collateral damage in a war that started long before they existed, casualties of trauma they had nothing to do with inflicting. Chapter 7. The Omen, living proof of the Crucible's endurance. Now we must address what happens when the Crucible doesn't ask permission, when it manifests in bodies whose parents didn't expect it, in a society that spent generations trying to suppress all evidence of it, in individuals who become living contradictions of the Golden Order's carefully constructed narrative. The Omen. The term itself reveals everything. An omen is a sign, a portent, an indication that something significant is happening or will happen. But the connotation is usually negative. An omen of doom, an ill omen, a warning that something has gone wrong. The omen aren't called that because they possess special powers or exhibit unique capabilities. They're called that because their existence is treated as evidence that something is failing. And what's failing, according to the Golden Order, is the bloodline itself, the purity of human form, the suppression of that chaotic primordial past that the Erdtree was supposed to have transcended. Omen are born to normal human parents, seemingly at random, with physical traits that mark them as Crucible-touched. Most prominently, horns, tangled curving horns that sprout from their skulls and continue growing throughout their lives, but also tails in some cases, scales, unusual growths. Every omen is unique in the specifics of their appearance, but all share the commonality of bearing traits that shouldn't exist in proper humans according to Golden Order ideology. They're not weak. Actually, they're superior to regular humans in many ways, stronger, more resilient, capable of wielding Crucible powers that normal people can't access. If the lands between were truly governed by merit, Omen would occupy positions of respect. But the lands between under the Golden Order is a theocracy where ideological purity matters more than practical capability. So instead of being celebrated, Omen are persecuted. Born to noble families, they're sealed away in the subterranean shunning grounds beneath Leyndell. Born to common families, they're killed at birth, their horns removed in procedures that usually prove fatal. Those who survive horn removal bear the scars for life, physical reminders of a society that would rather kill them than acknowledge them. The most famous Omen are twins, Morgoth and Mog, sons of Queen Marika the Eternal and Godfrey, first Elden Lord, born with extensive horns and tails, marked by the Crucible from birth. Being children of the ruling family didn't protect them. They were sealed beneath Leyndell, imprisoned in the subterranean shunning grounds, along with other omen, kept out of sight and out of mind. Think about what that means. Marika, who rules the lands between, who claims divine authority, who shapes reality through the Elden Ring, couldn't or wouldn't protect her own sons from the consequences of being omen. Godfrey, the warrior who conquered the entire land, who commanded the Crucible Knights, who was strong enough to face the Stormlord alone, couldn't or wouldn't prevent his children's imprisonment. Based on what we see, the curse of being omen seems to have been stronger than royal blood, stronger than parental love, strong enough that even the most powerful individuals in the lands between had to bow to it, or at least chose not to resist it. Morgoth's story is particularly tragic. He appears to have internalized the hate directed at him, accepted the Golden Order's judgment that his existence was cursed, and then dedicated his entire life to defending that same Golden Order, protecting the capital that had imprisoned him, serving the dynasty that considered him shameful. He became Morgoth, the Omen King, defender of Leyndell, the last loyal demigod still protecting the Erdtree. He used the name Margit the Fell Omen when confronting Tarnished, who sought to become Elden Lord, trying to prevent anyone from reaching the Erdtree, defending it from those who would claim it, even though he himself was deemed unworthy to stand in its presence, fighting for a system that treated him as less than human, as a mistake to be hidden away. When finally defeated after defending the capital through the entire shattering, after fighting off every would-be conqueror, he's still there, still loyal, still protecting. Godfrey's golden spirit mourns him. A crown is warranted with strength, Godfrey says, acknowledging that Morgoth deserved recognition he never received. Morg took a different path. Where Morgoth internalized the hate and tried to prove his worth to those who rejected him, Morg rejected the system entirely. He escaped the subterranean shunning grounds, found the Formless Mother, an outer god that welcomed what the Golden Order had cast aside. He established Morgwen Palace in the ruins of an ancient civilization, gathered followers who had also been rejected, and built an alternative power structure. Morg's path is darker, certainly. His plans are disturbing. His blood magic is grotesque. His dynasty of cursed blood represents everything the Golden Order feared about the Crucible made manifest. But it's also understandable. Why would someone treated as accursed their entire life maintain loyalty to the system that cursed them? Why wouldn't they seek power elsewhere, build something new with other outcasts, create a place where being Omen wasn't a liability? Both twins demonstrate different responses to the same fundamental injustice. Morgoth seeks acceptance through service. Morg seeks power through rebellion. Neither approach ultimately works. Morgoth dies defending a capital that never truly acknowledged him. Morg dies trying to force a transformation that was never consented to. Both are tragic figures, casualties of a society that couldn't accommodate what they were. The broader Omen population suffers similarly. Those sealed in the subterranean shunning grounds exist in a nightmare realm beneath the gleaming capital. The upper levels of Leyndell are golden and beautiful. The shunning grounds are filth and darkness and despair. Omen patrol as guards or exist as prisoners. It's hard to tell which. They wield power that would make them formidable warriors if deployed properly. Instead, they're wasted, contained, used only to guard other outcasts. Perfumers developed special mixtures specifically targeting omen physiology, ritual pots that could be thrown at omen populations. Whether the intent was humane management or outright extermination remains ambiguous. Either way, the fact that specific anti-omen implements exist demonstrates how thoroughly the Golden Order has systematized its persecution. But here's what the Golden Order doesn't acknowledge. The omen seem to demonstrate something fundamental, not morally or ethically in their individual actions, but ontologically. Their existence suggests that the Crucible never truly went away, that the Erdtree's supposed transcendence of its origins was incomplete. Horns still sprout, tails still grow, Crucible traits still manifest in living bodies, despite centuries of the Golden Order trying to eradicate them. The omen appeared to be living proof that you can't fully suppress primordial chaos. That imposition of order doesn't eliminate disorder, but just pushes it to the margins. And because they represent this uncomfortable truth, because their very existence undermines the Golden Order's foundational narrative, they have to be treated as cursed. Not because they actually are, but because admitting their natural manifestations of the Crucible would require admitting the Crucible still exists and still exerts influence. The connection between omen and the Hornsent becomes obvious once you know the history. The Hornsent celebrated horns as divine. The omen manifest horns naturally. In a different age, in a different culture, the omen would have been honored. But because Marika associates horns with her oppressors, because the Golden Order needs to distance itself from the Crucible, the omen are treated as the opposite of divine. It's projection, essentially. The trauma inflicted by the Hornsent gets redirected onto innocent individuals who happen to bear similar traits. The omen didn't oppress anyone. They didn't torture shamans or stuff people into jars. They were just born with horns in a civilization that had decided horns meant cursed. They're casualties of someone else's war, punished for resembling the enemy. This is why understanding the Crucible Knights' fall from grace matters when discussing the omen. Both groups channel primordial power. Both bear the Crucible's mark. The difference is, the Crucible Knights chose their path and were rewarded before being abandoned, while the omen never chose anything and were persecuted from birth. But the underlying dynamic is the same. The Golden Order cannot tolerate visible reminders of the Crucible, so anything Crucible touched must be marginalized, suppressed, or eliminated. The omen are tragic precisely because they're innocent. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't make bad choices or betray anyone's trust. They were simply born in a time and place where what they are is considered unacceptable. And because the prejudice against them is baked into the Golden Order's fundamental ideology, there's no path to acceptance. No amount of service, like Morgoth provided, earns respect. No amount of power, like Morg accumulated, grants legitimacy. They're permanently marked as other, as wrong, as evidence of failure. Throughout the lands, wherever omen are found, in the subterranean shunning grounds, or at various locations where they've been cast out. They represent shadows of what the Crucible Knights once were. Warriors with primordial power, marked by ancient traits, capable of channeling forces that normal humans can't. The difference is, the Crucible Knights were celebrated for it before being scorned. The Omen were never celebrated at all. Both prove the same truth. The Crucible endures. The Golden Order can rewrite history, can marginalize those who remember, can persecute those who manifest traits it doesn't like. But it cannot erase the source, cannot eliminate the primordial wellspring from which the Erdtree itself grew. The Crucible was, is, and will continue to be whatever narratives are constructed to deny it, and every omen born, every horn that sprouts, every tale that grows is proof of this. Living testimony that the past isn't past, that the Erdtree's foundation remains what it always was, that order built on chaos still rests on that chaotic base. The Omen are victims, but they're also evidence, and their continued existence, despite generations of persecution, despite systematic attempts to eliminate them, despite being cursed and shunned and killed, suggests that the Crucible is more fundamental than the Golden Order, more enduring than any empire, more real than any theological narrative constructed to deny it. Chapter 8. The Fall. When heroes become embarrassments. Success is a strange thing. Achieve too much, accomplish too completely what you were designed to do, and you might find yourself obsolete. Become too good at your purpose, and you risk making that purpose seem unnecessary. Win decisively enough, and people forget why the war needed to be fought at all. The Crucible Knights' tragedy is that they succeeded perfectly at establishing the age of the Erdtree. They fought alongside Godfrey, crushed his enemies, cleared the way for the Golden Order to take root and flourish. They were instrumental in transforming the lands between, from a place of primordial chaos into something organized, structured, governed by laws and grace. And that very success doomed them. Consider the sequence. Godfrey conquers the lands between with his Crucible Knights as elite shock troops. The giants fall. The Stormlord is defeated. Every major threat to the emerging Golden Order is eliminated. The Erdtree, that transformation of the Crucible into something ordered and refined, begins to flourish. Civilization develops around it. Culture emerges. The greater will's authority becomes absolute. And then, according to legend, Godfrey's eyes lost their golden hue. His grace faded. Queen Marika divested him of his blessing and exiled him along with his warriors, marking them as the first tarnished. They were driven from the lands between to wage war in distant lands, with promises that after their deaths, they would regain what had been taken from them and return stronger than before. But the Crucible Knights didn't follow Godfrey into exile. Most of them remained in the lands between. Devonia left for the realm of shadow, but the others scattered throughout the land, seeking new purposes, maintaining silent vigils, adapting to a world that no longer had use for them. Why didn't they follow their Lord? History doesn't explicitly say, but we can piece together possibilities from what we know. The Crucible Knights weren't just Godfrey's soldiers. They were champions of the Crucible itself, warriors whose very armor was imbued with that primordial power. Their connection was to something deeper than any individual lord, even one they respected as much as Godfrey. When Godfrey was exiled, the Crucible Knights seemed to have faced an impossible choice. Abandon the land where the Crucible existed, where the Erdtree grew from that ancient source, where their entire purpose was rooted, or remain without a lord, without official status, without the protection that Godfrey's authority had provided. Most chose to stay, and that's when the persecution truly began. The transformation happened gradually. At first, the Crucible Knights were simply marginalized, not openly persecuted, just quietly excluded, treated as relics of a bygone era, veterans who had served their purpose and could be respectfully ignored. Their contributions were acknowledged in the past tense, their powers explained away as necessary tools for a more primitive time. But as the Golden Order solidified, as the Erdtree's influence spread, as new generations emerged who had never known the age of Godfrey, the narrative shifted. The Crucible Knights weren't just outdated, they were embarrassing. Their bestial powers weren't just primitive, they were chaotic. Their appearance, their abilities, even their continued existence became problems to be addressed. Ancient accounts tell this story explicitly. The gauntlets they wore state, in time, the strength shown by these knights, and even their appearance, was seen as chaotic and deserving of scorn. This wasn't about actual chaos. The Crucible Knights were disciplined warriors who followed strict codes and fought with tactical precision. But they represented chaos symbolically. They were living reminders that the Erdtree's foundation was the Crucible, that order emerged from disorder, that the refined present grew from a wild past. The Golden Order couldn't tolerate that reminder. Its authority depended on presenting itself as naturally superior, divinely ordained, fundamentally different from what came before. Acknowledging the Crucible meant acknowledging that the Erdtree was just the Crucible reshaped, that the greater will hadn't created something new, but had colonized something ancient. So the Crucible had to be demonized, and by extension, anything touched by the Crucible had to be reframed as cursed. The Omen bore the brunt of this persecution. Born with horns and other Crucible traits, they were treated as accursed despite being children of royalty. Morgoth and Mog, twin sons of Queen Marika and Godfrey, were sealed in the subterranean shunning grounds beneath Leyndell. Other Omen had their horns removed at birth, a process that usually killed them. Those who survived were relegated to the lowest positions, viewed with fear and disgust, despite possessing strength and abilities that surpassed normal humans. The misbegotten faced similar treatment. Despite being capable warriors and craftsmen, despite their clear connection to ancient life and the Crucible's power, they were enslaved, treated as subhuman, forced into servitude. Their wings, their bestial features, everything that marked them as Crucible touched became justifications for oppression. And the Crucible Knights themselves, they scattered. Some tried to maintain their traditions in isolation. Others sought new lords to serve. A few remained openly present despite being scorned. But all of them became anachronisms, warriors out of time, embodiments of power that the modern world wanted to forget. We can track where they ended up across the lands. One was imprisoned in an evergall in Stormhill, sealed away, prevented from wandering freely, contained like a dangerous beast, rather than treated as a respected warrior. What this knight did to warrant imprisonment remains unknown. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps existing as a Crucible Knight was crime enough. Another remained in Stormvale Castle, hidden in a lower area beneath the ramparts. This knight doesn't attack unless approached, simply stands guard over an area that seems to have no particular strategic value, maintaining duty even when duty has become meaningless, protecting nothing from no one, because protection is what Crucible Knights do. Two ended up in Siofra River, that underground region where the stars shine artificially and ancient civilizations left their ruins. One near the aqueduct, another accessible through a portal, both far from the surface, far from the Erdtree's direct influence, existing in liminal spaces between the lands, between proper and something older. Two more made their way to Oriza Hero's grave, outside Lanedale. Ordovis and a companion, maintaining vigil in a tomb, surrounded by death traps and the honored dead. Did they choose this location, or were they assigned to it? Were they guarding something, or simply occupying a space where they wouldn't be seen by polite society? Siluria descended to deep-root depths, the vast underground region where the Erdtree's roots spread through ancient ruins and nameless eternal cities. She found the place where the Erdtree connects most directly to its origins, where the golden tree's roots touch primordial structures, where the lie of its divine purity is most obviously false. And she remains there, silent guardian of uncomfortable truths. Two Crucible Knights traveled to crumbling Farum Azula, that floating ruin of an ancient civilization that exists outside normal time and space. What drew them there remains enigmatic. Was it the ancient dragons, the connection to Placidus Axe and the age before the Greater Will, the sense that Farum Azula represented power predating even the Crucible? Some found new lords. One joined General Radan's forces at Redmane Castle, fighting alongside a leonine misbegotten. Radan, son of Radagon and Renala, apparently accepted what the Golden Order rejected. His symbol was Godfrey's lion, his hair the red inherited from his father, and his acceptance of diverse warriors suggested he understood strength regardless of its source. Another became bodyguard at Volcano Manor, serving the recusants who had rejected the Golden Order. A Crucible Knight serving there makes perfect sense. Both the knight and the manor's inhabitants were outcasts, both rejected by the establishment they had once helped create. Several remained in Lanedale itself, scattered through the capital as if unable to leave the heart of what they'd helped build. They don't serve the capital in any official capacity. They're just there, maintaining their own vigils, perhaps hoping that someday the Golden Order would remember their service and restore their honor. And then there are those who died. At least 2 Crucible Knights are deceased, their spirits appearing in the road's end catacombs, summoned by a spirit caller snail. They've been dead long enough that their physical forms are gone, but their spirits remain strong enough to manifest. Even death didn't release them from their duty, didn't free them from their identity as Crucible Knights. Devonia left entirely, journeying to the realm of shadow in search of the Crucible's origin. This was the most radical response, not adapting to the new reality, but rejecting it completely, seeking answers in territories beyond the Golden Order's reach. What's heartbreaking about all of this is the Knights' continued dedication. They don't rebel against the Erdtree, despite being treated as embarrassments. They don't join forces with enemies of the Golden Order, despite having every reason to do so. They simply persist, maintaining their standards, embodying their training, continuing to be Crucible Knights, even when being a Crucible Knight means living as an outcast. When encountered throughout the lands, they don't attack with rage or desperation. They fight with discipline, using techniques perfected over centuries of service. They manifest their powers with control and precision. They demonstrate that they're still elite warriors, still masters of their craft, still worthy of respect, even if the world refuses to grant it. That's the tragedy. They haven't declined. They haven't become lesser. They're still everything they were at their peak. But the world has moved on, established new hierarchies, created new symbols of power. The Crucible Knights represent an age that the Golden Order wants to forget, truths that undermine carefully constructed narratives. Consider what their treatment reveals about the Golden Order's insecurity. If the Erdtree were truly as divinely superior as claimed, if its power were genuinely different in kind from the Crucible's chaos, why would Crucible Knights be threatening? Why would their existence need to be marginalized? Why couldn't they be honored as heroes who helped establish the Order, then gracefully retired? The answer suggested by the evidence is that the Golden Order understands its foundation is the Crucible, that its supposed purity is refined chaos rather than something fundamentally different, that acknowledging the Crucible Knights' continuing power and dignity would force uncomfortable questions about where the Erdtree's power actually comes from. So instead, the Knights are scattered and scorned. Their service is forgotten. Their abilities are called chaotic. Their very existence becomes something embarrassing, something to be hidden away, or explained as unfortunate relics of less enlightened times. But they endure, scattered across the lands between, maintaining vigils that no one asked them to maintain, protecting places that don't need protection, embodying principles that the world has abandoned, still wearing their primordial gold armor, still wielding their ancient weapons, still capable of manifesting the Crucible's power whenever necessary, still Crucible Knights, even when being a Crucible Knight means living as remnants of a forgotten age. And that persistence matters, because as long as even one Crucible Knight remains, as long as someone can still manifest the powers, as long as the primordial gold armor still holds its energy, the truth cannot be completely erased. The Golden Order can marginalize them, can treat them with scorn, can pretend they're irrelevant, but it cannot make them disappear, cannot deny what they represent, cannot fully escape its own origins. Chapter 9: Legacy of the Primordial. So where does all of this leave us? We've traveled from the primordial crucible through the age of Godfrey, from the heights of the Crucible Knights' glory to their scattering and marginalization, from the Hornsense worship through Marika's vengeance to the Omen's suffering. We've seen how primordial power was celebrated, then demonized. How warriors who channeled chaos in service of order became embarrassments when order no longer needed chaos. How trauma shaped theology and theology shaped persecution. What does it all mean? The Crucible Knights and the Primordial Erdtree represent one of the deepest themes woven through history, that foundations matter, that where something comes from shapes what it is even after transformation, that you cannot fully transcend your origins, no matter how much you try to distance yourself from them. The Erdtree is the crucible, not descended from it, or inspired by it, or distantly related to it. The Erdtree is the crucible, reshaped by the greater will and Marika into something more ordered, more refined, more controlled. But the substance is the same. The power flows from the same source. The roots dig into the same primordial foundation. This is why the Golden Order's persecution of Crucible-touch beings is so tragically ironic. They're not suppressing something foreign to the Erdtree. They're suppressing the Erdtree's own nature. The Crucible Knights, the Omen, the Misbegotten, anyone bearing those ancient traits isn't representing opposition to the Erdtree. They're representing what the Erdtree actually is beneath its golden veneer. The naming of the Crucible Knights after geological periods is brilliant precisely because it emphasizes this deep time, this connection to eras so ancient they precede civilization itself. Ordovis from the Ordovician, Siluria from the Silurian, Devonia from the Devonian. These aren't random ancient names. They're specific periods from Earth's Paleozoic era, hundreds of millions of years ago, when life was radically different from what we know. These names were chosen deliberately to emphasize that the crucible represents something older than old, more fundamental than any current power structure. The Crucible Knights aren't just ancient warriors. They're living connections to eras when reality itself was different, when the rules governing life were fundamentally distinct, and they persist. Despite being scattered, despite being scorned, despite losing their lord and their status and their respect, they remain. Throughout the lands between, their armor still holds power, their weapons still function, they can still manifest the powers. They're diminished in numbers and influence, certainly, but they haven't been eliminated, haven't disappeared, haven't stopped being what they are. This persistence matters symbolically. It demonstrates that you cannot completely erase inconvenient truths by declaring them obsolete, cannot eliminate primordial forces by rebranding them as chaos, cannot deny your foundations just because acknowledging them is uncomfortable. Every Crucible Knight encountered is a walking refutation of the Golden Order's narrative. Their existence proves the Erdtree grew from the Crucible. Their powers demonstrate that those primordial forces remain accessible. Their dedication shows that commitment to ideals can outlast the institutions that spawned those ideals. When a Crucible Knight is defeated and their techniques claimed, when the ability to manifest horns or tails or fiery breath is learned, it's not accessing dead techniques from an obsolete age. It's tapping into power that was always there, always will be there. regardless of what current authorities claim about its legitimacy. It's channeling the same primordial source that the Erdtree channels, just directly instead of through the Golden Order's carefully controlled liturgies. This is revolutionary in a sense. The Golden Order maintains power partly by controlling access to grace, to the Erdtree's blessings, to the power structures it has established. But the powers drawn from the Crucible bypass all of that. They're not granted by the Golden Order. They're claimed from warriors who existed before the Golden Order and whose power predates the Greater Will's arrival in the lands between. Learning these ancient abilities is learning to access power independently of official channels. It's recovering ancient knowledge that authorities have tried to suppress. It's proving that there are sources of strength beyond what the dominant paradigm acknowledges. The Hornsent, for all their cruelty, understood something the Golden Order refuses to acknowledge. The Crucible is sacred, not because any particular culture says it is, but because it's literally the source of all life in the lands between. Everything alive comes from that primordial blending. Every species, every individual, every trait. The diversity of life itself is proof of the Crucible's generative power. Suppressing that, demonizing it, treating it as cursed. These aren't just theological positions. They're attempts to deny fundamental reality. And reality has a way of reasserting itself. Omen are born. Misbegotten persist. Crucible Knights endure. The Erdtree's roots still pulse with that red-tinged primordial gold. Devonia's quest to find the Crucible's origin, that solitary journey into the realm of shadow, represents the most profound response to the Golden Order's revisionism. Not accepting the official story, but investigating the original truth. Not adapting to marginalization, but pursuing understanding. Not settling for what's permitted, but seeking what's real. We don't know if Devonia succeeded. The knight remains at the ancient ruins of Rao, still watching the gate of divinity, still seeking. But the attempt itself is significant. It demonstrates that even after centuries of suppression, even after everyone else has given up, or adapted, or died, someone still cares enough about the truth to pursue it alone, without support, beyond the reach of the civilization that once celebrated them. That's what the Crucible Knights ultimately represent. Persistence in the face of abandonment. Dedication to ideals when the world has moved on. Maintenance of truth when lies are more convenient. They're not heroes in the traditional sense. They don't win grand victories or reshape reality. They simply endure, maintain their standards, continue being what they've always been, even when being that brings scorn instead of celebration. And that endurance reveals the Golden Order's weakness. If the Erdtree truly had transcended the Crucible, if the Greater Will's order truly was superior to primordial chaos, then Crucible Knights wouldn't be threatening. They could be honored as interesting historical figures, their powers studied as curious remnants, their service acknowledged without embarrassment. The fact that they're marginalized instead, that their powers are called chaotic, that their existence is treated as shameful, proves the Golden Order knows its claims are fragile, knows that acknowledging the Crucible Knights means acknowledging uncomfortable truths, knows that its entire ideological foundation rests on suppressing knowledge of where it actually came from. The Crucible Knights are dangerous not because of their martial prowess, though that's formidable. They're dangerous because they're proof. Walking, breathing, horn manifesting proof that the Golden Order's origin story is incomplete at best, that the Erdtree is not divinely superior to what came before, that order and chaos are not opposites, but different phases of the same fundamental force. And in a world where power and truth are intimately connected, where understanding reality grants ability to shape reality, that proof matters enormously. The Crucible Knights aren't just warriors. They're witnesses, testifiers, living records of an age the Golden Order once forgotten. As long as they exist, the truth cannot be completely buried. As long as their powers can be learned, that power cannot be monopolized. As long as their armor holds primordial gold, that foundation cannot be denied. This is why those who walk the lands between should pay attention to the Crucible Knights beyond just their formidable nature as opponents. They're not just difficult encounters. They're keys to understanding deeper themes about power, legitimacy, and how authorities construct narratives to maintain control. Every Crucible Knight encountered is an opportunity to question the Golden Order's story, to investigate what came before, to understand that the gleaming golden tree rests on red-tinged chaotic foundations. And when Morgoth is finally faced at the capital's threshold, when you see a royal omen defending the Erdtree despite being rejected by it, when you understand that he bears crucible traits just like the knights who served his father, the connections become clear. The Crucible Knights, the Omen, the Hornsent, the Misbegotten, all of them are part of the same story. The story of how primordial power persists despite attempts to suppress it, how origins matter despite efforts to transcend them, how truth endures despite narratives constructed to deny it. The Primordial Erdtree, that red-gold crucible of life where all forms were blended together, never truly disappeared. It just got covered over, rebranded, repurposed. But it's still there, still the source, still the foundation, still churning with potential for life to take any form, for boundaries between species to blur, for chaos to bubble up through the cracks in order's facade. And the Crucible Knights still guard that truth, whether anyone wants them to or not, scattered across the lands between, wearing armor that predates the current age, wielding weapons forged from primordial gold, manifesting powers that authorities call chaotic, but which are simply natural expressions of life's fundamental nature. They're remnants, yes, relics of an age that has passed, but they're also prophets in a sense. Proof that what we call the past is never truly past, that foundations shape structures regardless of attempts to deny them, that the Crucible was and is and will continue to be, no matter what the Golden Order claims. So when a Crucible Knight is encountered, in an Evergaol or a castle or deep underground, don't just see a challenging opponent. See a piece of living history, a guardian of ancient truth, a warrior who chose to remain loyal to primordial power even when that choice meant scorn and marginalization and exile. See what the Golden Order fears most: proof that its authority rests on foundations it cannot control, cannot eliminate, cannot fully suppress, proof that the Erdtree grew from chaos, that order emerged from disorder, that the gleaming golden age was built by warriors channeling powers the current age calls cursed. See the Crucible Knights as they truly are, not relics of a bygone era, but witnesses to eternal truths, not embarrassments to be hidden, but monuments to powers that endure beyond any civilization's ability to suppress them. The Crucible endures, the Knights endure, and as long as even one remains, the truth cannot be erased, the source cannot be denied, the foundation cannot be forgotten, no matter how much gold is painted over it. In the end, that's the most important thing to understand about the Crucible Knights and the Primordial Erdtree. They represent continuity, connection between past and present, between chaos and order, between suppressed truth and official narrative. They prove that history isn't linear, that power doesn't flow in one direction, that what authorities call obsolete often turns out to be eternal. And in a world of cycles of death and rebirth, of order breaking down and being rebuilt, of tarnished warriors challenging the status quo, that message resonates perfectly. The old order isn't as orderly as it claims. The new age isn't as new as it pretends. And the warriors who remember the truth, who bear the marks of that primordial chaos, who manifest powers that predate current authorities, they're not relics. They're the future remembering the past. They're proof that foundations matter. They're living demonstrations that you cannot transcend your origins. You can only acknowledge them or deny them. And denial, however thorough, however backed by institutional power, however long sustained, eventually fails. Because the Crucible endures, and its knights endure with it, scattered but not broken, marginalized but not eliminated, scorned but not diminished, still standing, still manifesting horns and tails and wings and breath, still carrying weapons forged from primordial gold, still wearing armor that holds the power of life itself, still reminding anyone who encounters them that the Erdtree's golden age rests on red gold foundations, that order grew from chaos, that the source of all life in the lands between is not the greater will's divine mandate, but the Crucible's primordial churning, and that truth, like the warriors who embody it, cannot be killed by silence or suppression or shame. It simply endures, waiting for anyone brave enough to look past the golden surface and acknowledge what lies beneath. That's the legacy of the Crucible Knights. That's the significance of the Primordial Erdtree. Not power, though they possess that. Not glory, though they achieve that. But truth. Simple, uncomfortable, undeniable truth about where we come from, what we're made of, and what endures when civilizations try to forget their foundations. The Crucible was, the Crucible is, the Crucible will be, and its knights stand watch over that eternal truth, generation after generation, age after age, era after era, still manifesting the ancient powers, still channeling primordial force, still proving that you cannot erase what you're built on, no matter how much you try. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight, through the primordial chaos that became the golden tree, through the warriors who channeled that chaos in service of order, through the civilizations that celebrated and then suppressed that ancient power. If you found value in exploring the Crucible Knights and the Primordial Erdtree, Please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into Elden Ring's rich lore. There's so much more to discover, so many connections to make, so many truths hidden beneath the surface. Until next time, may you manifest your own powers with skill and honor, and may you remember that foundations matter, that origins shape destinies, and that the primordial chaos we try to suppress is often the source of our greatest strength. The Crucible endures, and so do we all.